You're listening to Collected, stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher.
What I can see in this picture and knowing more of his story is I can see the pain in his face and I can see the longing for home and I can see the vacant stare that he really wants to be somewhere else. Very sad eyes.
We'll be finding out more about this striking portrait and the young Indigenous soldier with the sad, faraway eyes. But first, let's meet Danusha.
So my name's Danusha and I'm working here as an Indigenous research officer here at the Australian War Memorial. I'm from Larrakia country. I've come all the way from Darwin, living here in Canberra for about 25 years or so.
Danusha's part of the team that researches and records the names and experiences of Indigenous defence personnel. Interestingly, her own family history was shaped by war.
I've held a really long fascination and passion for family history, and I enjoy discovering information about the past. I think that's through my own life experiences. My maternal grandmother, or grandparents were greatly affected by World War II, and in 1939 Hitler's Nazi Party was in power and Germany invaded Poland, and 2 years later my grandmother and her elder sister were abducted at gunpoint and they were removed from their parents.
In Poland?
In Poland, yeah. And my grandmother was only 14 years old and she never returned home to her family home in Krakow. She and her sister were forced to work in the fields in Germany growing crops for German soldiers, and they lived in a ghetto and worked hard labour every single day until the war ended. My grandfather, he was a farmhand, he was displaced from his home in Poland as well. And they both ended up in a refugee camp after the war where they met.
Danusha's maternal grandparents arrived in Australia in 1950. They settled in Brisbane with their 2 young children, including Danusha's mum.
My grandmother got off the boat and she says the ladies from the Red Cross were so lovely. They offered her a cup of tea and 2 Arnott's arrowroot biscuits. And she was very definite about the type of biscuit.
And the fact there were 2.
That's right, the fact that there were 2. There wasn't one, there were 2. She told me other stories, but they weren't as pleasant. And but I think what I always admired about her was that she had so much resilience and courage and had this never give up attitude, So no matter what her small family had faced at the time, she managed to make do and survive.
Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, Danusha's father was born.
My father, he was a child born of war. And I don't know if you know what that means, but it's commonly referred to as children who have one parent, which is usually the mother, that is a member of the local community, and then the father is part of a foreign army. So my grandmother, she wasn't a huge part of my life. I didn't really know her that well, but I did meet her a couple of times, and she was an Aboriginal woman from Western Australia, and she was born to an unwed mother and was placed into a children's home when she was very young, and she lived there her whole childhood. She worked hard manual labour there as well. And her birth family never ever mentioned her and never made contact with her again, so she never knew them. When she was 21, she had to move out of the home. They were, moving her on. She had to make her own way in the world. And she fell into a bit of trouble with the law and, for fraternising with coloured men. And I found some interesting articles on Trove and they're a bit comical. Can I read you a piece?
Yes, please. These are newspaper articles?
It's a newspaper article from 1945, and it just the way it's written, I think you could not have an article with this type of wording in our PC environment today. But it says, her hands in her pockets, her lips pouting in an expression of contempt for everything around her. She strolled into the dock, an idle and disorderly charge against her. I plead guilty to the not working part, but I'm not idle or disorderly, she drawled, thrusting her hands deeper into the pockets of her loose-fitting dress and leaning her not unattractive body over the rail.
Oh my gosh. And that's your grandmother?
That's my grandmother. And I just love the end bit, you know. So dark-skinned Audrey went on her way again, this time to jail for a month. Turning her head slowly, she made a biting remark to the magistrate and then disappeared from view.
She sounds amazing. And so she went on to have your dad. What do you know about that?
Well, she got pregnant with my father in her late 20s and Dad never knew who his father was, and he had a name, that was it. And the whole family started to wonder, well, is this name real? And we spent many decades searching and found nothing, you know. But on Christmas Day 2018, which was a full 70 years, I'm going to get emotional now, 6 months and 9 days after my father was born, and 19 years, 6 months and 1 day after his death, I uncovered the identity of my grandfather.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow, Danusha, tell us about that.
He was an American sailor or a merchant marine. I still haven't found his service record, but he had travelled to Western Australia in the 1940s. And what wasn't known to my grandmother at the time when she got pregnant, he had his own wife and family back home in America, in New York. And he requested her to make no further contact. So the descendants of this family I met in person for the first time in America last year. I took my family over with me, and my American family, all the many cousins and the aunties and uncles, they welcomed me with open arms, and it was so lovely. But they were like so eager to get to know the Aussies in the family. And I think the most curious thing I wanted to know was, what did they know about us? What did they know about my father?
And did they know anything about him?
No, they never knew we existed. We grew up for decades never knowing of each other, you know, and I think that's quite sad that we've missed out on all that time together.
And that your father never knew?
My father died not ever knowing, so, you know. But I think what people have to understand is that meeting my family and having this story that's 7 decades old, you know, it was so emotional. And I did burst into tears when I first saw them. So I can't put into words this feeling of acknowledgement and respect and belonging and understanding. And now that I have, you know, I've fulfilled this lifelong journey and mission to find out who my grandfather was. And it's for this reason I really wanted to apply for this Condi program, because I wanted to be able to provide information that could give that feeling of acknowledgement and respect and belonging and understanding to other people. Yeah. And
you yourself are a product of the upheavals of war. When I say a product, you're a person, but you know, transgenerational trauma, I think, is what people refer to it as now. And you do suffer things that you don't know why you suffer. But it's because of trauma that's been experienced by family members. You know, you feel that in your life. It's there, it's hidden, locked in your psyche. So it is there. Danusha's personal history gives her great insight and understanding into the importance of her work. She maintains the Indigenous Servicemen and Women's List. It currently contains around 2,000 names.
This year during NAIDOC Week, we had a really exciting launch. It was the first time a national list has ever been published. So that's up on the War Memorial's website that anyone can go have a look at. And these names are going to be regularly added as the web team does their updates, so people will see the list grow. So the list was started many decades ago, like in the late 70s, so around the time I was born. It was started by a Queensland MP, Don Cameron, and he had advertised in national newspapers looking for Indigenous servicemen and women and wanted people to write in with names. And the letters and faxes that were sent to Don Cameron are actually here in the archives at the Australian War Memorial.
So why was he interested in compiling the list in the first place? Do you know?
He wanted to give people acknowledgement, which is what we want to do as well. And this list has been handled by many people over these decades. Our long-time volunteer, Margaret Beebman, she took up this baton and decided to find service numbers for all these men and women that were on the list. And she had found more names during her research. And she had these lever arch folders, like a massive amount of lever arch folders just filled with names. And then squadron leader Gary Oakley, he's a proud Gundungurra man. I hope I said that right, Gary. He's the former Indigenous liaison officer here at the Australian War Memorial. And he digitised all this information in these lever arch folders and carried on the research. So now it's my job to maintain this list, and that's been passed to me, and I feel it's actually a really great honour to be part of this history. I have people ask me, so what is it you actually do? And I jokingly tell them I'm a ghost hunter. And you know what, it feels like that some days, because you're looking for people that you knew existed and all you have is a name, but trying to find any trace of them on this earth can be quite difficult.
The history of Indigenous service is complicated. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have served in every conflict and commitment involving Australian defence contingents since Federation, including both World Wars. But they weren't asked about, or were often forced to deny their heritage. At the start of the First World War, many Indigenous Australians who went to enlist were rejected on the grounds of race, though some slipped through. By late 1917, when recruits were getting harder to find, restrictions were eased. It was a similar story during the Second World War. But even when they were officially banned, Indigenous Australians found ways to serve.
They said that they were Maori, or that they were Indian, or that they were other cultures, and they were enlisting that way, which is making our job difficult because that is on their attestation papers. You'll pull up the person's file and it'll say they're Indian, but they're not. So it's a bit interesting, yeah.
So how do you find out the truth?
I've actually had help with a historian in Dubbo. Her name's Sandra Smith. So when I get stuck on something, I send things to her because she's got a wider network and has been in this game longer than me, so can find out more information than what I can. So I usually refer stuff to her, and she's been a wonderful help to the memorial. Yeah.
So I suppose that you rely a lot on families to tell you that, Uncle so-and-so we know is an Indigenous man. We know that he enlisted, but that may not be clear from his record. Is that the sort of thing that happens?
It does, and you find that as you go along, like I call it, you're going down a rabbit hole and you start following a path, and sometimes the path can lead you to somewhere really weird, and you find out that the person later on in life becomes a famous boxer or had gallantry medals, that were given to them. So it's interesting to find out the life of the person, but in finding that out, it can be difficult because what we use is publicly available information. It's not that we're using a special system or ASIO or anything like that.
You've just got to doggedly search for it.
That's exactly right. It's a lot of research, and I don't think people understand if you go down that rabbit hole, you can get stuck.
You're listening to Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. Danusha went down one of these rabbit holes when she investigated the service record and a POW photo of a Private David Harris. She discovered that this Indigenous soldier also had two sisters, Myrtle and Ruby May, who served in the RAF in the Second World War.
Names of Indigenous service women are very few and far between. So finding one feels like you've won lotto. Yeah, it's actually wonderful to find a name.
But what is even more extraordinary is the way the identity of Private Harris himself was discovered. He's the young man in the portrait Danusha referred to right at the start, and for nearly 70 years no one had made the connection. To tell us that story, it's time to introduce one of Danusha's colleagues, Curator Garth OConnell.
As part of my work here, and also part of my personal interest, being an Aboriginal soldier myself, is just to always look through bits and pieces of information, collate things, write down details and names and numbers. I'll come across people online who'll mention a relative or a mate who says a mate of mine's got a relative who served in his mob. And as part of my thing at work, I was just flicking through a book called Forever Warriors by the late Jan Kabali James. She's a Western Australian lady who became adopted by the local Noongar community because of her work in genealogy. And her book is a real tome of Western Australian families and communities that served in the Australian Defence Force. And about 6 years ago now, I think it was, I was flicking through the book at lunch and I come across a photo, and it's an enlistment photo.
It was a small black and white photo of a young man called David Harris, a West Australian farmhand who'd enlisted at the age of 20.
So I'm looking at this photo of this young man looking right down the barrel of the camera, and I'm there going, he looks familiar. I stopped, and then I looked at it, and then I just kept going. I read through, and then continued on with the Harris names, because the book is in alphabetical order, and the Harris family have got heaps of family have served across multiple conflicts, Vietnam, contemporary stuff, and World War II. And so I just tagged him as being a POW. And then I went to the next Harris, and the next Harris, and the next Harris, changed pages. And then I was like halfway through a chew, and then I've just gone, he looks familiar, like there's something about him I've got to go back and look at. So then I went back a page or two. I'm looking at the guy's face, and they're thinking, I've seen him somewhere else. And that was when I then went, no, that can't be right, no. So then I stuck a pen in the page, because the book's pretty fat, and I got on the computer, and they're sitting there going, oh, what's that artwork by Stella Bowen? And then I put in, I know Gowrie House, that's the place where the thing is, so I put Gowrie, as in Lord Gowrie, the big guy during the war. And then I looked up Gowrie House, and up come that artwork of this unknown Australian soldier that was painted in 1945 by the Aussie war artist Stella Bowen. And so then I'm there going, oh my God, that could be him, maybe. I don't know, because no one's ever found this guy out. Despite that artwork being on display many times in the galleries, online, in books.
So thousands of people would have seen that portrait of that unknown young man, that former POW that Stella Bowen painted at Gowrie House in England, and no one had identified him.
Exactly. And it had been perplexing for years, because I remember looking at it when I was a young fella in southwest Sydney going to school, and had a history book on World War II stuff, and it had that artwork, and they're thinking he must be a black fella, because he's got that look on his face, but he's got this unusual sort of stare off into the distance. He's not looking directly at Stella, he's looking over sort of her shoulder and into the distance. And so that's one thing which always stuck in my head about how this young guy is just sitting there looking out. He's just been released from captivity, and he's been given a fresh uniform and his pay and everything, and no one knew who he was. And anyway, so I'm at my desk. I then pressed print, and I made sure I pressed print in colour, and then I then took that back into the staff room area, and then I sit back down, and I'm looking at the photo next to the artwork, and they're going, that's him. That's wow. And they're thinking, hang on, if it's going to be this guy, he has to have been captured by the Germans or the Italians, because he gets released in May 1945, and he's going through Gowrie House in London, near London, and that's like a repatriation place for all the soldiers and sailors and airmen who've been captured in the European or Mediterranean theatre of war. So there's a lot of Air Force and a lot of Army and not many Navy for Australia. So he had to be captured in North Africa or in Greece or Crete, Australian Army, and he looks to be Aboriginal because he's dark. That all made sense, because I'm thinking, okay, this guy here, Harris, he's captured with the 2nd 11th Battalion in Crete. He's seriously wounded.
And all that information was in Jan Kabali James's book.
Yeah, so using her little paragraph, and that's all she has, because she can't go into too much detail. She just have, name, number, and a really quick synopsis on what they did, Army, Western Australia, or served overseas. So that was the important sort of foot in the door. And so using that, I then took the big fat book, Forever Warriors. I then took it back into the office with the artwork I printed out. I then jumped onto the National Archives website. And if you don't know, they are really, really good for families and researchers and nerds like me who want to look up family, like stories and yarns. And so I'll then put his number into the database, and then I'm going through where it said he gets wounded in his statement, and then it mentions in his movements Eastbourne, and I just went boom, and that's got the date of when the artwork got done. So what I thought I'd found was him, because I've got a wounded guy who gets captured. He's Aboriginal, he's in Western Australia, and he's in the same exact location that the artwork was painted that same week.
And they look so alike. You can see the resemblance.
Oh, yeah. So it was important that to get the momentum up, I then went and told Auntie Margaret Beedman, who's like a volunteer here for decades at the memorial. She is a senior Jewish elder here in Canberra, but she's also our matriarch for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff here at the memorial. So I spoke to Auntie Margaret, and she knows Karbali, or she knew her. So we then gave her a call, literally gave her a call, and she was, wow, that's great, yeah, cool. So she knew the family, of course. So then she then had a yarn to the family, and got back to us a few minutes later and said, Garth, I've given you the number for his niece. She's here in Western Australia. I then hung up the phone, spoke to this niece, sent her an email with a photo of the photograph and the artwork, and she called me back and was crying, saying, that is him. I can't believe it. You've done it. We didn't know this artwork existed. Thank you so much. And I then made sure we sent them a nice copy of the image for the family as well. And the big thing was she confirmed a whole lot of stuff for us, and it was like such a big moment, like for me personally and professionally, and we were just all stunned.
Strangely, it was 69 years to the day that Stella Bowen started the painting that she'd titled simply Private Gowrie House.
Stella painted a bunch of paintings as part of a series during her week or three there. And then it's not recorded why she chose David Harris, whether she went up to him or he went up to her. But she would have seen literally thousands of young men coming through there, getting their pay, getting their rail pass to go on leave finally. They get like a free telegram to send home to tell their mum and dad or their loved ones, hey, I'm alive, I've been rescued, I'm safe in England. So there would have been a whole lot of emotions going on, and that's what makes me think, I wonder what he was thinking when he gets asked by this lady, a female war artist, who says maybe, look, excuse me, can I just have you sit down for a little while and I'll paint you? He's obviously said yes. Then he's just sitting there, and for how long? I don't know. I just wish I was a fly on the wall there, seeing what happened in that, and it would have made things a lot easier for us to suss out who this young man was in the artwork.
And you wonder whether he ever saw the finished work too.
Exactly. He died many years ago, so we're unable to know if he knew that. I can imagine I've come back from several deployments overseas with the Army in more modern times, and in that time you did come back, a lot of things happen, and sort of things get swirled and mixed up in your memory. So when they get asked months or years later, how was it when you got back? It's like I'm sitting there going, what happened? That's right, I had to get all the paperwork done, inoculations, had to get interviews done, had to get a psych interview done, and there's similar things he had. And we know he had those interviews because in his documentation on the National Archives, he's interviewed and he gives full responses for how are the conditions, how are you treated, and what did you do? And he basically says the conditions were rotten, and that's his own words and his own handwriting. And it appears as well that he at one point was actually accosted in the prisoner of war camp by a bunch of fellow POWs who are not Australian by a razor gang. And he's mentioned in some other accounts by a Private Mervyn Marlowe, who'd also been captured in Greece. And he mentions that there was an account of an Australian Aboriginal POW having a razor held to his throat by one such gang. A fellow Australian gave the man's name as Dave, in inverted commas, and stated that he was a member of the 2nd 11th Battalion who'd fought at Redimo on Crete before his capture. Now, that description fits David Harris exactly to a T. So it's interesting how that account came from a fellow prisoner of war at Lambsdorff, which was major POW camp which he was at. So, and as well, in our research on David Harris and his family, the Aspinall family got in touch with us, and we found out David Harris's best mate, and that was her dad, Walter Larkman. He'd also been captured, and they'd been mates World War II. So they go into action together in Crete, and the family sent us other photos of David Harris, which helped us to confirm with the angle of the photos how they fit the same sort of pose of David Harris. So that really helped us out, and it helped this family as well appreciate their own family's service, and it brought back a lot of positive memories of her father, Walter Larkman, had also served.
David Harris returned to Australia, resumed his work as a labourer and had a family. He died at the age of 49 in 1969. It's estimated there should be around 7,000 names on the Indigenous Service list. The team at the memorial are keen to add as many as they can. Both Garth and Danusha say the project is all about acknowledging and paying respect to people whose service and sacrifice was too often ignored or forgotten.
These men and women came back from war and they fell under the Aborigines Protection Act, which meant they faced so much discrimination, and they were barred from return services leagues clubs, and I think that's quite sad. They couldn't go to a pub and have a beer with their mates. They were barred from that too. So I believe working on this list and finding these names is a step towards reconciliation. And we're putting an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander face on the Anzac legend. And Indigenous people cared so deeply for their country. They went and fought for it. We want to acknowledge them for who they are and what they actually did for Australia.
So obviously there are many more names that you could add to your list. How are you going to find them, and what sort of help do you need?
Well, we're asking for help from the public. If there's anyone out there that has a name of an Indigenous serviceman or women, we'd like you to contact us and let us know. And even if you recall a relative that might have served with an Indigenous serviceman or woman, that person's name may be lost to time. But if you still have the name of your relative and the unit that they served in, it could assist us in locating someone, So there's lots of photos in the Australian War Memorial Collection depicting Indigenous service people, but we need a name to the face. So please help us acknowledge these men and women.
You've talked, Danusha, about your own personal history, so affected by war. So what does it mean to you now, partway through this project, what you've uncovered so far, but what you're looking forward to finding? What does it mean to you personally?
It means that we are finding those names. We're finding those people that have been lost to time. We're finding and acknowledging those people and being proud of them. I think it's important that we stand up and we are proud of them. And we show that respect, because it is about respect, and Indigenous culture is very heavily ingrained about showing respect to your elders, and these people would be my elders, so it is about doing that, and that is important to me.
It helps sort of give back a bit of dignity to these unknown people, because you see it in many photos and artworks and film that we have here at the memorial and other collections around the world. You'd love to know who the people are you're looking at and what their story is and where they came from, and having us identify one person really means a lot, I believe, to not just the family of that said person, but also to him or her, because it puts a name to a face and helps fill out that sort of human side of the story. And that's why I'm really proud of this story, and it's really special and that to have these people identified. And that day, I didn't wake up thinking I'd be identifying this artwork that we didn't know about for 69 years. It's just another day at work, really. But afterwards, I remember going home, before the family got back to me, thinking, I hope this is it. I don't want to have got the family's hopes up. So there's this sort of double-edged sword of going, oh no, what if I've got their hopes up? This isn't David Harris, it's some other bloke. But thankfully, we were able to get a positive identification, and it was such a good feeling.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. You can subscribe to the series by going to the Memorial's website or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.